In the final desperate hours of the war in Europe, as the German Reich trembled on the brink of collapse, a strange and almost unreal silence settled over shattered cities and ruined forests. The guns had not yet gone silent, but everyone, soldiers, civilians, generals, prisoners, felt something shifting. And before we go any deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. By the spring of 1945, it was no longer a question of if Germany would surrender, but when, and under what terms, to which enemy, and under whose authority. The regime was dead in every way except officially. Hitler was locked in his underground bunker in Berlin, paranoid, exhausted, and furious that the armies he once believed unstoppable were collapsing everywhere. His generals knew the truth. The Third Reich was finished. The Allied forces were converging from all sides. The Americans and British were advancing from the west, sometimes moving forward dozens of miles in a single day. The Red Army was pushing from the east, closing in on Berlin with unstoppable momentum. Millions of people, soldiers and civilians, were trapped between the collapsing front lines, but surrender is never a single moment. It's a process of hesitation, denial, confusion, and desperation. Germany's final collapse was a tangled chain of conflicting orders, frightened civilians, divided generals, and armies that still fought even when nothing was left to fight for. In early May 1945, the German High Command was in chaos. Some generals wanted to surrender immediately to prevent further bloodshed. Others wanted to surrender only to the Western Allies while continuing to resist the Soviet Union. Still others wanted to negotiate for their own safety as the Reich disintegrated around them. No one was fully in control. A German officer later wrote in his diary, "Orders came every hour, and every hour they contradicted the last." Another described the mood as a regime that had died but didn't yet know how to admit it. And standing in the center of this confusion was General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff of the German High Command. He would become the reluctant face of Germany's surrender. When Jodl arrived at Allied headquarters in Reims, France, on May 6, 1945, the war was effectively over, but fighting still raged in pockets across Europe. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were still armed. Many were still receiving orders. Some were still resisting. The Western Allies had no interest in partial agreements or conditional surrenders. Eisenhower made the terms painfully clear. Germany must surrender unconditionally to all Allied armies at the same time. No exceptions, no negotiations, no delaying tactics. Inside the small French schoolhouse that had been transformed into a temporary command center, Jodl studied the surrender document with dread. He knew that signing it would seal the fate of millions of German soldiers still trapped in the East. It would also formally end the regime he had served for years. That night, Jodl sent a message to Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who had technically succeeded Hitler as head of state. Jodl asked if he should sign. Dönitz, who hoped to save as many Germans as possible from falling into Soviet hands, reluctantly agreed. "Authorize the signature," he wrote back. "Save as many people as you can." In the early hours of May 7, 1945, Jodl signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender. It was 2:41 in the morning when the final signature was put to paper. His hand reportedly trembled. He looked exhausted. The room was silent except for the scratching of pens. The news of the surrender spread quickly. There were celebrations among Allied troops and civilians. Church bells rang across Europe. Crowds gathered in the streets of London, Paris, and New York. People hugged strangers. They cried, they laughed, they shouted. But the world didn't yet know the full story. The surrender Jodl signed was not enough. Stalin was furious. He declared the Reims signing unacceptable. If Germany was going to surrender, it would surrender in Berlin, under Soviet authority, in the capital of the regime that had invaded his country 4 years earlier. He demanded a second ceremony. The Western Allies, not wanting to ignite political conflict at the very moment the war ended, agreed. And so Germany, unbelievably, would have to surrender a second time. While diplomats argued, the German military continued collapsing hour by hour. Entire units surrendered in the field. German commanders ignored old orders and laid down their arms. streams of civilians fled westward. Even Waffen-SS units, fiercely loyal to Hitler until the end, began to crumble. British patrols reported that hundreds of German soldiers approached with their hands raised, exhausted and relieved. One American infantryman wrote home, "They came out of the woods like ghosts. They looked like they'd been holding their breath for years." Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Soviets prepared a grand hall in the Karlshorst district for the second surrender. Soviet marshals wore full uniforms covered in medals. Giant flags hung from the walls. Stalin wanted the world to witness Germany's defeat where it mattered most, in the ruins of the city Hitler believed would rule Europe for 1,000 years. The man chosen to sign this second surrender was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, one of the highest-ranking surviving German officers. When he arrived in Berlin, witnesses described him as pale, stiff, and exhausted. One Soviet soldier remembered, "He looked as if he were being led to his execution." Keitel entered the hall slowly, removed his gloves, and took his seat. The weight of Germany's total defeat hung over him. His hands shook as he picked up the pen. At exactly 10:43 p.m. on May 8, 1945, Keitel signed the final act of military surrender. This time there were no arguments, no delays, no negotiations. Germany's war was over. The greatest conflict in human history on the European continent had finally ended. Around the world, the celebrations erupted again. This time they were even louder. In London, Churchill appeared before cheering crowds. In New York, Times Square overflowed with people. In Moscow, fireworks lit the sky for hours. But the reaction inside Germany could not have been more different. Many Germans listened to the news in silence. Some cried, some stared at the floor. Others simply sat down wherever they were and waited for the future to arrive. One German soldier later said, "We didn't celebrate, we didn't talk, we just sat down and waited for whatever would happen next." German civilians faced a landscape of destruction. Cities were rubble, families were scattered. Food was scarce, millions were homeless. For some, surrender meant hope, for others it meant fear, for all it meant uncertainty. For survivors of the concentration camps, the surrender meant something far greater. It meant liberation. Soldiers entering the camps found unimaginable suffering, but also a spark of hope, people whispering, "We are free," even when they were too weak to stand. But the surrender didn't end the suffering for millions. The aftermath brought its own challenges. Displaced persons, POWs in Soviet camps, hunger, disease, occupation, interrogation, and war crimes trials. Germany had fallen before the world fully understood the horrors that had taken place inside it. Allied forces began occupying cities, establishing order, providing food, caring for refugees, and securing evidence of the regime's crimes. The borders of Europe began shifting. Governments were formed, dissolved, and reorganized. Tens of thousands of German officials were arrested. Millions of soldiers and civilians were processed, questioned, and separated into categories. For many Germans, the surrender brought a single, overwhelming feeling: survival. They had lived through 6 years of war, and those years would shape the rest of their lives. For the Allies, it was victory, but at a terrible cost. Cities destroyed, families broken, lives lost on a scale the world had never seen. And yet, despite everything, people across Europe tried to rebuild. Families returned to shattered homes. Children played in the ruins. Farmers tried to find enough seeds to plant. Soldiers went home, unsure of what waited for them. And slowly, painfully, life began again. The day Germany surrendered marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, a new, uncertain world that would shape the next century. It was not a clean ending. It was not a simple resolution. It was a moment where millions realized that the war was finally over, but the consequences were only beginning. In the first hours after the surrender, a strange mixture of stillness and movement spread across Europe. The guns fell silent, yet the world felt louder than ever. For those who had lived through the war, the silence itself felt foreign, almost unsettling. Veterans later recalled that the quiet was the first thing they noticed, a quiet so deep it felt unnatural, as if the earth had stopped breathing for a moment. Across Germany, soldiers walked out of their shelters, their trenches, their makeshift defensive lines. Some carried white flags. Others simply dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The war they had been fighting for 6 long years had ended while many were still in the field, unaware until Allied units informed them face to face. Many Germans later recalled that the moment of surrender felt surreal, almost like waking up from a nightmare and not fully believing the morning was real. Near the Elbe River, a group of German soldiers emerged from the woods and approached an American checkpoint. One of the Americans wrote in his journal that the German officer saluted him, not out of loyalty to a defeated army, but out of exhaustion and relief. "We are finished," the officer said, "all of us." His words captured what millions felt. In other places, German troops surrendered to the British or Canadians in long, orderly lines, sometimes miles long. They marched silently, helmets dangling from their belts, carrying only their personal items. They were no longer fighting men, they were displaced people, wandering between defeat and an uncertain future. But not all surrendered peacefully. In some areas, Waffen-SS units continued fighting even after the official surrender had been announced. They refused to believe the war was over, or perhaps they simply preferred death to capture. Small pockets of resistance continued for days, but they were isolated, confused, and quickly overwhelmed. The war had moved without them, and the world was ready to move on. Meanwhile, millions of civilians faced their own version of surrender. Cities lay in ruins. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin, once vibrant metropolitan centers, had become landscapes of broken walls and collapsed roofs. Streets were filled with rubble, twisted metal, and discarded belongings. Many people wandered the ruins searching for family members, hoping someone had survived, fearing the worst. A German woman in Berlin wrote in her diary, "We opened our eyes after the surrender and realized we had no homes, no food, no heat, no government, no future, only the possibility of beginning again." Her words captured the emotional weight of defeat more clearly than any official statement ever could. The occupying forces faced immediate challenges. Allied troops entering German cities were not only soldiers, they became administrators, rescuers, judges, and sometimes the only source of order. In some places, civilians approached them hesitantly, unsure how they would be treated. In others, they approached desperately, pleading for food, water, or medicine. American troops often shared rations with children. British engineers helped restore water and electricity. Soviet troops, dealing with their own trauma and rage after years of unimaginable suffering, approached the occupation very differently. Each army carried the scars of the war they had fought, and those scars shaped how they treated the defeated population. The surrender also revealed the true scale of the war's atrocities. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps, the world learned what had been hidden behind barbed wire and guard towers. Soldiers who had seen combat across Europe wrote that nothing prepared them for what they found in the camps. The survivors were skeletal, barely able to stand, but they greeted the liberating soldiers with tears, with whispered thanks, with a sense of hope that had seemed impossible just days before. The images recorded in those first hours became some of the most important documentation in modern history. They showed not only the end of a war, but the end of a system built on cruelty, oppression, and mass murder. The surrender was not only a military event, it was a moral reckoning, a moment when the truth could no longer be denied. As the days passed, the Allied powers divided responsibility for Germany. They created occupation zones: American, British, Soviet, and French. Berlin, though inside the Soviet zone, was divided the same way. These divisions would shape the next half-century, laying the groundwork for the Cold War. But in May 1945, none of that was certain. The future was still fluid, as fragile as the ruins around them. The German people faced difficult questions: who had supported the regime, who had resisted, who would be held responsible, who could help rebuild the country. The process of denazification began. It was a slow, complex, and often controversial effort to remove officials from positions of power, to identify those who had participated in crimes, and to rebuild society on new foundations. For many, the surrender brought shame; for others, relief. For some, especially those who had opposed Hitler from the beginning, it brought a quiet sense of vindication. But for everyone, it brought change, a future no one had imagined, shaped by a war no one could forget. In the countryside, German prisoners filled makeshift camps set up by the Allies. Some camps held tens of thousands of soldiers at once. Many waited weeks or months to be processed. Letters home were rare. Food was rationed. Conditions were often harsh, but for most, the war was finally over and survival, not victory, became the main goal. In Soviet captivity, the situation was far harsher. Many German POWs were transported east, some never to return. For them, the surrender marked the beginning of years of forced labor, hunger, and harsh conditions. Their stories were often untold or silenced, overshadowed by the enormity of the war itself. The surrender also brought the beginning of massive displacement. Millions of ethnic Germans fled or were expelled from Eastern Europe. Refugee columns stretched for miles, filled with families carrying what little they had left. These movements were some of the largest population shifts in modern history, shaping Europe's demographics for generations. Yet even in the middle of all this suffering, life continued. Weddings were held in bombed-out churches. Children played in the rubble, using pieces of broken machinery as toys. Teachers held lessons outside when buildings were too damaged to use. Small theaters reopened, offering music and plays as a brief escape from the trauma of daily life. Human resilience, even after total defeat, remained astonishing. As spring turned to summer, the Allies intensified their efforts to rebuild. Engineers repaired bridges. Doctors treated malnutrition and disease. Administrators restored local governments. And all the while, the trials of Nazi leaders began. The Nuremberg trials would become a symbol of international justice, a moment when the world declared that crimes against humanity would not go unpunished. For many Germans, watching these trials was a painful confrontation with the past. Some denied responsibility. Others admitted their guilt. Many claimed they had simply followed orders. But the evidence was clear, and the world demanded accountability. As months passed, the idea of a new Germany slowly emerged. The surrender had cleared the ground for something different, something unthinkable during the years of Nazi rule. Democracy would eventually take root in the West. A very different system would take shape in the East. The division between the two would define global politics for decades. But on the ground, in 1945, most people were focused on simpler things: finding food, building shelter, reconnecting with family, and surviving the coming winter. The surrender had ended the war, but it had not ended hardship. Recovery would take years. Healing would take generations. And yet, despite all the pain, uncertainty, and loss, the surrender marked the beginning of peace. Europe had taken its first step away from destruction and toward rebuilding. The day Germany surrendered was not just the end of a war. It was the moment a new world began to take shape, forged from the ruins of the old. Many who lived through those days later said that the surrender did not feel like victory or defeat. It felt like release. A release from fear, from violence, from a future ruled by war. One German survivor said decades later, "It was the first day in years that I woke up and realized I might live long enough to grow old." For the Allies, the victory ceremonies ended quickly. Soldiers returned home in stages, often to lives that had changed just as drastically as Europe had. Some struggled with the memories of the war. Others found new purpose in rebuilding their own families and communities. For Germany, the surrender was a moment frozen in time, the border between one era and the next. The past could not be undone, and the future had not yet arrived. Millions stood at that border together, unsure of what their country would become, but aware that it would never again be what it had been. The day Germany surrendered was a day of endings, but it was also a day of beginnings, a day of grief, but also of hope. A day when the world closed one of its darkest chapters and turned, slowly and painfully, toward something better.